Chapter 11, Part 1 of the Book of Camping and Woodcraft, a guidebook for those who travel in the wilderness. Recording by April Walters. The Book of Camping and Woodcraft, a guidebook for those who travel in the wilderness, by Horace Kephart. Chapter 11, Camp Cookery, Part 1. A true epicure can dine well on one dish, provided it is excellent of its kind. Grimaud de la Reynière. There is nothing between the high art of a cordon bleu and a steak toasted on a stick. Lord Dunraven. A good cook makes a contented crew. Noah. Bread, porridge, drinks. Home cookery is based upon milk, butter, and eggs. 9/10 of the recipes in a standard cookbook call for one or more of these ingredients. But it often happens to us campers that our tin cow has gone dry. Our butter was finished long ago, and as for eggs, we have heard of eggs, but for us they do not exist. In such a case, no ordinary cookbook is of any use to us. One can carry milk and butter and eggs. He can also carry a standard cookbook. Footnote: the best all-round treatise on camp cookery with which I am acquainted is the Manual for Army Cooks, which you can procure for 50 cents, stamps not accepted, from the Superintendent of Documents, Washington, D.C. End footnote. So I will not burden these pages with many recipes other than the do without kind. Only such dishes are described as can be cooked with the most primitive utensils, or none at all, over an open fire, or in an earth oven dug on the spot. Let it not be thought that this spells misery or even privation. Some of the dishes here described surpass anything that can be had at the Waldorf or the Maison Dorée. Full details are given for each dish, because I know from experience that an amateur cook needs them. Poor cookery is not so much the result of inexperience as of carelessness and inattention to details. A man who has never cooked a meal in his life can succeed with almost any of these recipes at the first or second trial, provided he follows the directions religiously. But let him not discard the book and fall back upon the light of nature, which is but another name for main strength and awkwardness. A bad mess is sure to follow from 1. A poor fire, 2. Seasoning too much or too early in the game, 3. Too little heat at the start or too much thereafter, 4. Handling or kneading dough made with baking powder. And it is more likely than not to result from guessing at quantities instead of measuring them. The cooking fire. Half of cookery is the fire thereof. It is quite impossible to prepare a good meal over a higgledy-piggledy heap of smoking chunks, or over a fierce blaze, or over a great bed of coals that will warp cast iron and melt everything else. One must have a small fire, free from smoke and flame, with coals or dry twigs in reserve. There must be some way of regulating the heat, and there must be some sort of rampart around the fire, on which pots and pans will perch level and at the right elevation, and perhaps a frame from which the kettles can be suspended. It is a very simple matter to build the fire aright in the first place. An outdoor range. When merely making a one-night stand in summer, start a small cooking fire the moment you stop for camping, and put your kettle on. Then you will have coals and boiling water ready when you begin cooking, and the rest is easy. Supper will be ready within 20 minutes. To make an outdoor range, fell a small straight tree and cut from it 2 logs, about 6 feet long and 8 or 10 inches thick. Flatten the top and one side of each with the axe. Lay these bed logs side by side, flat sides toward each other, and about 3 inches apart at one end and 8 or 10 inches at the other. This is provided you have no fire irons. If you have, all that is needed is a short chunk or thick rock at each end to support the irons. Build a fire of small sticks and bark from end to end. The bark of hemlock and of hardwoods is better fuel than wood when you want coals in a hurry. Then plant at each end of the fire a forked stake about 4 feet high, and across the forks lay a cross stick (lug pole) of green wood. Now cut 2 or 3 green crotches from branches, drive a nail in the small end of each, invert the crotches, and hang them on the lug pole to suspend kettles from. These pot hooks are to be of different lengths, so the kettle can be adjusted to different heights above the fire, first for hard boiling and then for simmering. If kettles were hung from the lug pole itself, this adjustment could not be made, and you'd have to dismount the whole business in order to get one kettle off. Footnote: It is curious how many different names have been bestowed upon the hooks by which kettles are suspended over a fire. Our forefathers called them pot hooks, trammels, hakes, hangers, pot hangers, pot claws, pot crooks, gallows crooks, pot chips, pot breaks, gibs or gib crooks, racken crooks. A chain or pierced bar on which to hang hooks was called a racken or reckon, and I know not what else besides. Among Maine lumbermen, such an implement is called a lug stick, a hook for lifting kettles is a hook stick, and a stick sharpened and driven into the ground at an angle so as to bend over the fire, to suspend the kettle from, is a wambeck or a spigelia. The red gods alone know why. The frame built over a cooking fire is called by the Penobscots kitchi plachwagum, and the Micmacs call the lug stick a chiplockwagon, which the white guides have partially anglicized to wagon stick. It is well to know and heresy to disbelieve that after boiling the kettle it brings bad luck to leave the wagon or spigella standing. If this catalogue does not suffice the amateur cook to express his ideas about such things, he may exercise his jaws with the Romany (gypsy) term for pot hook, which is kekavisko saster. Many and many a time I have watched old and experienced woodsmen spoil their grub, and their tempers too, by trying to cook in front of a roaring winter campfire, and have marveled at their lack of common sense. Off to one side of such a fire lay your bed logs as above, then shovel from the campfire enough hard coals to fill the space between the logs within 3 inches of the top. You now have a steady, even heat from end to end. It can easily be regulated. There is level support for every vessel, and you can wield a short-handled fry pan over such an outdoor range without scorching either the meal or yourself. In windy weather, or where fuel is scarce, it is best to dig a trench about 18 inches wide, 12 inches deep, and 4 feet long, with a little chimney of flat stones or sod at the leeward end, to encourage draught. Build the fire in this trench with fire irons or green sticks laid across it for the frying pan, and a frame above for the kettles. Clay oven. In permanent camp, if you have no oven, a good substitute can soon be made in a clay bank or steep knoll nearby. Dig down the bank to a vertical front. Back from this front, about 4 feet, drive a 4 or 5 inch stake down to what will be the bottom level of the oven. Draw the stake out, thus leaving a hole for flue. It is best to drive the stake before excavating, as otherwise it might cause the roof of your oven to cave in from the shock of driving. Now, from the bottom of the face, dig a horizontal hole back to the flue, keeping the entrance as small as you can, but enlarging the interior and arching its top. When the oven is finished, wet the whole interior, smooth it, and build a small fire in the oven to gradually dry and harden it. To bake in such an oven, build a good fire in it of split hardwood sticks, and keep it burning hard for an hour or 2. Then rake out the embers, lay your dough on broad green leaves, basswood from choice, or on the naked floor, and close both the door and the flue with flat stones or bark. If no bank or knoll lies handy, build your form for your oven by first setting up a row of green stick arches, like exaggerated croquet wickets, one behind the other, and cover with sticks laid on horizontally like a roof. At the rear, set up a round stake as core for the chimney. Now plaster wet clay thickly all over except the door. Let this dry naturally for a day in hot sunlight, or build a very small fire within, and feed it only as needed to keep up a moderate heat. When the clay has hardened, give it another coating to fill up the cracks that have appeared. Then give it a final firing. When you have a bed of coals that you want to save, and there are not enough ashes in the fire, cover the coal with bark. This will leave plenty of ash on top. Bread. Bread is the staff of life, no less in camp than elsewhere. Yet, to paraphrase Tom Hood, who has not met with camp-made bread rolled out of putty and weighted with lead? It need not be so. Just as good biscuit or johnny cake can be baked before a log fire in the woods as in a kitchen range, nor is any special knack required. The notion that a man is either a born cook or a hopeless dough-dunk at the business is all moonshine. Bread making is a chemical process. Pay close attention to details, as a chemist does, from building the fire to testing the loaf with a sliver, then if you do fail, it will be because of bad materials. As for me, I was not born a cook, nor do I like to cook, but during the past year of almost continuous camping alone, I have made some sort of bread or biscuit about every other day. My only failure is chargeable to a razorback who nosed into camp and upset my pan of dough. Strange to say, something invisible zipped through the air just then and nipped off that pig's tail. Biscuit. These are best baked in a reflector. 12-inch holds about 1 dozen, 18-inch holds 1½ dozen, unless a camp stove is carried or an oven is dug. Build the fire high by leaning sticks on the leeward side of a large backlog. Split wood burns better than round. Have spare dry sticks in reserve, slender ones, with which to replenish the fire. Grease the bake pan with a bit of pork rind. For 2 dozen biscuit, 3 pints flour, 3 heaping teaspoonfuls baking powder, 1 heaping teaspoonful salt, 2 heaping tablespoonfuls cold grease, 1 scant pint cold water. Mix thoroughly with a big spoon or wooden paddle. First the baking powder with the flour, then the salt. Rub into this the cold grease, which may be lard, cold pork fat, drippings, or bear's grease, until there are no lumps left and no grease adhering to the bottom of the pan. This is a little tedious, but don't shirk it. Then stir in the water and work it with a spoon until you have rather stiff dough. Do none of the mixing with your fingers. It makes biscuit sad. Squeeze or mold the dough as little as practicable, because gas that makes a biscuit light is already forming and should not be pressed out. Flop the mass of dough to one side of the pan, dust flour on bottom of pan, flop dough back over it, dust flour on top of loaf. Now rub some flour over the breadboard, flour your hands, and gently lift loaf on board. Flour the bottle or bit of peeled sapling that you use as a rolling pin, also the edges of can or can cover used as biscuit cutter. Gently roll loaf to 3/4 inch thickness. Stamp out the biscuit and lay them in pan. Roll out the culls — what do women call those remaining fragments? — and make biscuit of them too. Bake until edge of front row turns brown. Reverse pan and continue until rear row is similarly done. Don't expect to brown the tops in a reflector. Time 20 to 25 minutes in a reflector, 10 to 15 in a closed oven. Different brands of baking powder vary in strength. Royal is here assumed. The amount of water required varies somewhat according to quality of flour. Too much water makes the dough sticky and prolongs the baking. Another way to make biscuit — they taste different from above, but are perhaps just as good — is to use enough water to make a thick batter and drop this from a big spoon into the pan. Do not stir the batter more than you can help. Dumplings. If you're going to have boiled meat or a stew for dinner, make enough extra biscuit dough that you can drop the culls in the pot about half an hour before the meat is done. They make capital dumplings. Baking in Dutch oven. This time-honored utensil is a cast iron pot on short legs, with heavy iron cover, the rim of which is turned up to receive coals from the fire. If it were not for its weight, it ought to be in every camp outfit, for it is the best oven in the world for all kinds of baking. The delicious cornbread of the South is made from nothing but meal, salt, and water, owes its excellence to the Dutch oven, which not only bakes, but cooks the dough in its own steam. The juices of meats cannot escape from such an oven. To use the Dutch oven, place it and its lid separately on the fire. Get bottom of oven moderately hot and the lid quite hot, but not red, lest it warps it will never fit thereafter. Grease the bottom and sprinkle flour over it. Put the bread in it and cover. Rake a thin bed of coals out in front of the fire, stand oven on them, and cover the lid quickly with more live coals. Replenish occasionally. Have a stout hook to lift lid with, so you can inspect the progress of baking from time to time. Army bread. 1 quart flour, 1 teaspoonful salt, 1 tablespoonful sugar, 2 heaping teaspoonfuls baking powder. As this is made without grease, it is easier to mix than biscuit dough. Mix the ingredients thoroughly and stir in enough cold water, about 1½ pints, to make a thick batter that will pour out level. Mix rapidly with spoon until smooth, and pour out at once into Dutch oven or bake pan. Bake about 45 minutes, or until dough no longer adheres to a sliver stuck in the loaf. It keeps fresh longer than yeast bread and does not dry up nor mold. This is the kind of bread to bake when you're laying in a 3-day supply. It is more wholesome than biscuit and is best eaten cold. Frying pan bread. If you have no reflector or oven, make up dough as for biscuit, but work it into flat loaves, handling as little as practicable. Grease or flour a frying pan and put a loaf in it. Rake some embers out in front of the fire and put pan on them just long enough to form a little crust on the bottom of loaf. Then remove from embers and with a short forked stick, the stub of which will enter hole and end of handle, prop pan up before fire at such angle that top of loaf will be exposed to heat. Turn loaf now and then, both sideways and upside down. When firm enough to keep its shape, remove it, prop it by itself before fire to finish baking, and go on with a fresh loaf. In this way, you can soon lay in a 2 days' supply. A tin plate or a thick slab of non-resinous wood heated till the sap begins to simmer may be used in place of frying pan. Unleavened bread. Quickly made, wholesome, and good for a change. Keeps like hardtack. 2½ pints flour, 1 tablespoonful salt, 1 tablespoonful sugar. Mix with water to stiff dough and knead and pull until lively. Roll out thin as a soda cracker, score with knife, and bake as above. If you have no utensil, work dough into a ribbon 2 inches wide. Get a club of sweet green wood, birch, sassafras, maple, about 2 feet long and 3 inches thick. Peel a large end, sharpen the other, and stick it into ground, leaning toward fire. When sap simmers, wind dough spirally around peeled end. Turn occasionally. Several sticks can be baking at once. Bread for one man's meal can be quickly baked on a peeled stick as thick as a broomstick, holding over fire and turning. Unleavened bread that is to be carried for a long time must be mixed with as little water as possible, merely dampened enough to make it adhere, for if any moisture is left in it after baking, it will mold. To mix dough without a pan. When bark will peel, use a broad sheet of it. A sheet of canvas or dried hide will do. It is easy enough, though, to mix unleavened dough in the sack of flour itself. Stand the latter horizontally where it can't fall over. Scoop a bowl-shaped depression in top of flour. And keep the right hand moving round while you pour in a little water at a time from a vessel held in the left. Sprinkle a little salt in. When a thick adhesive dough has formed, lift this out, pat and work it into a round cake about 2½ inches thick. Australian damper. Build a good fire on a level bit of ground. When it has burned to coals and the ground is thoroughly heated, mix dough as above, rake away the embers, lightly drop the loaf on the hot earth, pat it smooth, rake the embers back over the loaf until it is thickly embedded in them, and let it bake from 1½ to 2 hours, depending upon size of loaf. This is the next best thing to an ash cake of cornmeal, which is a dish fit for a king. Sourdough bread, irreverently known as pizened dog, is the standby of Alaska miners. Mix a pail of batter from plain flour and water, and hang it up in a warm place until the batter sours. Then add salt and soda, not baking powder. Thicken with flour to a stiff dough, knead thoroughly, work into small loaves, and placing them before the fire to rise. Then bake. Salt rising bread. This smells to heaven while it is fermenting, but makes a wholesome and appetizing bread, which is a welcome change after a long diet of baking powder breadstuffs. For baking of 2 or 3 loaves, take about a pint of moderately warm water, a pleasant heat to the hand, and stir into it as much flour as will make a good batter, not too thick. Add to this ½ teaspoonful salt, not more. Set the vessel in a pan of moderately warm water, within a little distance of a fire or in sunlight. The water must not be allowed to cool much below the original heat, more warm water being added to pan as required. In 6 to 8 hours, the whole will be mixed in active fermentation, when the dough must be mixed with it, and as much warm water, milk if you have it, as you require. Knead the mass till it is tough and does not stick to the board. Make up your loaves and keep them warmly covered near the fire till they rise. They must be baked as soon as this second rising takes place. Unless the rising is used immediately on reaching its height, it sinks to rise no more forever. Selah. To bake raised bread in a pot. Set the dough to rise over very few embers, keeping the pot turned as the loaf rises. When equally risen all around, put hot ashes under the pot and upon the lid, taking care that the heat not be too fierce at first. Lungwort bread. On the bark of maples, and sometimes of beeches and birches, in the northern woods there grows a green, broad-leaved lichen, variously known as lungwort, liverwort, lung lichen, and lung moss, which is an excellent substitute for yeast. This is an altogether different growth from the plants commonly called lungwort and liverwort. I believe its scientific name is Sticta pulmonacea. This lichen is partially made up of fungus, which does the business of rising dough. Gather a little of it and steep it overnight in lukewarm water, set near the embers, but not near enough to get overheated. In the morning, pour off the infusion and mix with enough flour to make a batter, beating it up with a spoon. Place this sponge in a warm can or pail, cover with a cloth, and set it near the fire to work. By evening it will have risen. Leaven your dough with this, saving some of the sponge for a future baking. Let the bread rise before the fire that night, and by morning it will be ready to bake. It takes but a little of the original sponge to leaven a large mass of dough, but see that it never freezes, and it can be kept good for months. Flapjacks made without milk or eggs are not equal to those Mother used to make, but they fill the hiatus when a quick meal is demanded. 1 quart flour, 1 teaspoonful salt, 2 teaspoonfuls sugar to make them brown, 2 level tablespoonfuls baking powder. Rub in, dry, 2 heaped tablespoonfuls grease. If you have no grease, do without. Make a smooth batter with cold water, thin enough to pour from a spoon, but not too thin or it will take all day to bake for the party. Stir well to smooth out lumps. Set frying pan level over thin bed of coals, get it quite hot, and grease with piece of pork in split end of stick. Pan must be hot enough to make batter sizzle as it touches. Pour from end of a big spoon successively enough batter to fill pan within 1/2 inch of rim. When cake is full of bubbles and edges have stiffened, shuffle pan to make sure the cake is free below and stiff enough to flip. Then hold pan slanting in front of and away from you, go through preliminary motion of flapping once or twice to get the swing, then flip boldly so cake will turn a somerset in the air and catch it upside down. Beginners generally lack the nerve to toss high enough. If you land a hot cake on the other fellow's eye, it serves him right for monkeying so near the cook. Grease pan anew and stir batter every time before pouring. John's pancakes. Sometime, when you really have eggs, etc., and wish to produce something really fine, try the following recipe, which I have modified a little from Boardman's Lovers of the Woods. It is the invention of his guide or helper, John. Crumb up a thick slice of stale bread, rejecting the crust, and put it to soak in a medium-sized pail with a cupful of water. When the crumbs have soaked soft, stir in with them 1 big tablespoonful evaporated cream, or the equivalent, 2 tablespoonfuls syrup, and 2 more cupfuls water. Melt carefully so as not to burn, butter the size of an egg. Remove from fire and stir in 2 eggs and 1 tablespoonful salt. Stir this into your crumb dope. Now stir in 1 quart flour, or enough to make batter as thick as molasses. Just before baking, stir in 2 teaspoonfuls baking powder. Have the frying pan snapping hot and keep it so. Above is a meal for 2 or 3 hungry men. Such cakes rest lightly on the cook's conscience and buoy up the whole crowd. Plain cornbread. Pone or Johnny cake is easily and quickly made, more wholesome than baking powder bread, more appetizing than unleavened wheat bread, and it sticks to the ribs. To be eaten hot, and like all hot breads, should be broken with the hands, never cut. Bread left over should be freshened by moistening and reheating. The amount of water to be used depends on whether the meal is freshly ground, moist, or old, dry, and yellow meal requires 1/2 more water than white. 1 quart meal, 1 teaspoonful salt, 1 pint warm but not scalding water, 1½ pints for yellow meal. Stir together until light. Bake to a nice brown all around, preferably in Dutch oven. Test with sliver. Done in about 45 minutes, but improved by letting stand 15 minutes longer away from fire to sweat in oven. Eat with bacon gravy. If you have no oven, plank the bread on a hot slab before a high fire, having previously formed slight undercrust by laying on hot ashes, or make ash cake by forming into balls as big as hen's eggs. Roll in dry flour, lay in hot ashes, and cover completely with them. Time for ash cake, 15 to 20 minutes. Corn dodgers. Salt some white cornmeal to taste. Mix with cold water to stiffen dough, and form into cylindrical dodgers 4 or 5 inches long and 1½ inches diameter by rolling between the hands. Have frying pan very hot, grease it a little, and put dodgers on as you roll them out. As soon as they have browned, put them in oven and bake thoroughly to a crisp brown. Snow bread. After a fall of light feathery snow, superior corn bread may be made by stirring together 1 quart cornmeal, 1/2 teaspoonful soda, 1 teaspoonful salt, 1 tablespoonful lard. Then, in a cool place where snow will not melt, stir into above 1 quart light snow. Bake about 40 minutes in rather hot oven. Snow, for some unknown reason, has the same effect on cornbread as eggs have, 2 tablespoonfuls of snow equaling 1 egg. It can also be used in making batter for pancakes, if the batter being made rather thick and the snow mixed with each cake just before putting in pan. Cornbread with baking powder. Mix together 1½ pints yellow cornmeal, 1/2 pint flour, 1 tablespoonful sugar, 1 teaspoonful salt, 3 heaping teaspoonfuls baking powder. Work in a cupful of cold lard or grease. Add enough cold water or milk to make a stiff batter, about 2 pints. Grease and flour your baking pan, frying pan, or Dutch oven, pour the batter in, and bake 40 minutes. Above makes a cake 9¼ by 2 inches, weighing 3¾ pounds. Buckwheat cakes. Nobody knows what real buckwheat cakes are until has eaten those baked by a Pennsylvania Dutchwoman from batter made with a genuine dark-colored buckwheat flour ground in the country mill and raised overnight with yeast. There is as much difference between them and the city restaurant kind as there is between a ripe fig and a dried codfish. However, we can't have them in camp, so here is the next best. 1 pint buckwheat flour, 1/2 pint wheat flour, 2 tablespoonfuls baking powder, 1/2 teaspoonful salt. Mix to a thin batter with milk if you have it, otherwise water. Rice cakes. When you have cold boiled rice left over, mix it half and half with flour and proceed as with flapjacks. Cold boiled potatoes or oatmeal may be used in the same way. Rice cakes are best mixed with the water in which rice has been boiled. Oat cakes. 1. Mix oatmeal with cold water and a little salt into a thick paste. Pat out as thin as possible with a spoon and bake on frying pan. 2. Mix 1/2 pound oatmeal, 1 ounce butter, and a pinch of salt with enough water to make a moderately thick paste. Roll to a thickness of 1/3 inch, bake in frying pan, and give it to the Scotchman. He will bless you. Fried quoits. Make dough as for frying pan bread. Plant a stick slanting in the ground near the fire. Have another small clean stick ready, and a frying pan of lard or butter heated sissing hot. There must be enough grease in the pan to drown the quoits. Take dough the size of a small hen's egg, flatten it between the hands, make a hole in the center like that of a donut, and quickly work it, the dough, not the hole, into a flat ring of about 2 inches inside diameter. Drop it flat into the hot grease, turn almost immediately, and in a few seconds it will be cooked. When of a light brown color, fish it out with your little stick and keep it hanging on the slanting one before the fire to keep hot. If the grease is of the right temperature, the cooking of one quoit will occupy just the same time as the molding of another, and the product will be crisp and crumpety. If the grease is not hot enough, a visit from your oldest grandmother may be expected before midnight. Adapted from Lees and Clutterbuck. Stale bread. Biscuit or bread left over and dried out can be freshened for an hour or two by dipping quickly in and out of water and placing in the baker until heated through. Or the biscuit may be cut open, slightly moistened, and toasted in a broiler. If you have eggs, make a French toast by dipping the slices in whipped eggs and frying them. With milk, make milk toast. Heat the milk, add a chunk of butter and some salt, toast the bread, and pour milk over it. End of chapter 11, part 1. Recording by April Walters.